Welcome to Bach 101, an introduction to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, a presentation of Music Worcester. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Shepard, the Artistic Director of The Complete Bach. Now, let's talk Bach. Welcome back for this second episode in Bach 101 about Bach's Fugues. And for those of you who know Bach's music and love his fugues, you would know that we could do 100 episodes about Bach's fugues and still only really touch the surface. Such is the importance of his contribution, not just in his own writing, but the way that he affected every fugue that was written after him, from Mozart and Beethoven on to Shostakovich and Benjamin Britten. But we will limit ourselves so that you don't have to be here forever. In our first episode about Bach's fugues, we used the Sicut locutus est from Bach's Magnificat. And if you remember, what I said is that it is easiest to understand the fugue when there are words attached, when singers are singing, because it helps you to follow the subject and the counter subject. That subject, Sicut locutus locutus, and the counter subject, Abraham et seminie, and so on and so forth. It's easier when there are words attached. However, Bach wrote a great number of fugues just for instruments, most principally for keyboard instruments, either the harpsichord, though often performed on piano these days, and of course for the organ. He was a master of the fugue on the organ. So today in this episode, I wanted to concentrate on those keyboard fugues. There's a piano, a harpsichord fugue, but I will play it on piano myself, and then an organ fugue to be played for you by Wesley Hall, one of our great organists in Worcester and a member of the Worcester Bach Collective. Now, as always, we talk about our 3 E's, don't we? Encyclopedic, economical, and enigmatic. I mentioned that encyclopedic connection to fugues in the first episode with his Art of the Fugue collection, in which he explores every possible way to write a fugue. Well, there is actually, for the keyboard, 2 collections that are especially encyclopedic. These are called the Well-Tempered Clavier. It's a sort of awkward translation of the German. Well-tempered refers to the fact that the harpsichord was tuned in a way that you could play in any possible key. Now, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but for some of you who know about Baroque tuning, you would know there were various systems, and in those systems, sometimes some keys sounded grotesquely out of tune. So well-tempered meant that you could play in any key, and everything would be equally slightly out of tune. This is sometimes called equal temperament. And this allowed him to pursue the idea of writing a fugue in every possible key. C, C sharp, D, D sharp, well, or E flat, depending on the enharmonic spelling, in major or minor keys. He wrote 2 of these collections that had 24 preludes and fugues in each of them, so a total of 48, and he paired a prelude with a fugue. A fugue rarely existed on its own. Most often, this was paired with a prelude, and a prelude is a general sort of piece, so a prelude and a fugue, or perhaps a fantasia, which was more improvisatory seeming, a fantasia and a fugue. The fugue that we're going to use today is the fugue in C minor from the first book. And I thought that it would be fun to just have me play it for you and see, can you find the number of subjects? Because we did train your ear to start to be able to hear those subjects. This is what the subject sounds like for this fugue. So let me play the whole thing for you and see if you come up with the correct number of fugue subjects. Here we go. It is the fugue in C minor from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. How many did you come up with? Did you come up with 8? I hope so, but you could be forgiven if you only came up with 7, because that fugue subject exists all but once in that minor key. And as we learned, that can be in different keys. But it still sounds like it doesn't in that minor key. There is one example in a major key. And you honestly could be forgiven for not really hearing that. But I think you probably did pretty well after that first episode of listening to fugues together. With this fugue, the subject that I really want to look at is how does Bach generate an entire composition from one idea? You know enough about fugues now to know just how economical they are by design. That you have the subject and you have the counter subject, and that exists all the way through the piece. You may remember the word episode, but the episode is also based on the ideas in the subject. Let's take a second and orient your ears to the subject and the counter subject themselves, and then we'll talk about that construction. So as I played for you, the subject, and then here's the counter subject. It starts with a scale. Do you hear that it goes down a scale? And then eighth notes. And do you remember what I said in the first episode? That the counter subject, for it to interlock with the subject, has to be contrasting. So the fugue subject itself is very repetitive. Dee-da-dum, bum, bum, dee-da-dum, bum, bum, dee-da-dum, bum, ba. So it has that almost like an ostinato. An ostinato is a rhythmic pattern that repeats. I want to teach you a new word that is really important, not just in looking at subjects in fugues, but really all the way through Bach's music. The idea of the economical composition means that you begin with quite a small idea, and we call that idea in music theory a motto. Motto comes from the word for word. It's like a small word. And the motto for this fugue is that ostinato. Ba-da-dum, bum, beam. And you get that half step, ba-da-dum, which is really a kind of tiny trill. It doesn't keep going. It's just a mordant, actually. It's called ba-da-dum, beam, ba-da-dum, beep, bum, ba-da-dum, beep. And then the way it finishes is a little bit more complicated. Da-da-dee, da-da-dum. But again, it's that rhythm, isn't it? Ba-da-dum, be-da-dum. So then the counter subject, which has, it finishes the scale. Then, as I said, it's eighth notes. So it's a little bit more legato. Let me play the subject and then add the counter subject to the subject that moves on. So you see it's a little bit more flowing. I chose this fugue for you because that motto is almost entirely omnipresent. There are 31 measures in this piece, and by the way, we're going to put the PDF up online so you can see it and you can see the different ways that I've marked things. So if you want to look at the score, you'll get a sense of it. All except for 3 bars have that motto. Ba-da-dum, bum, beam, ba-da-dum, beam, bum. That is not true of all fugues. In fact, I could probably say fairly confidently, it's not even true of very many fugues. This idea that the opening motto or even the material from the subject would be present all the time. Yes, it's true that Bach bases the material on it, but it won't necessarily be present all the time. You're going to see that later in this episode when we look at the organ fugue that Wesley's going to play for us, that Bach goes much further afield during the episodes. Let's just take a second and talk about why that might be. This fugue reminds me a lot of ba 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 ba, beep ba ba ba, of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, that opening movement. That ba 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 beep ba ba ba, that little motif or motto is present for so many of the bars in that piece as well. So there's a certain insistence to it. The important thing to know is that this idea is going to be all the way through this. Let me show you, for example, in the first episode, so this is no presence of the subject, but he takes that motto and moves it around. Let me show you what I mean by that. So now we begin to be able to use some pretty common words in music theory that we are going to need to use a lot in talking about Bach. Don't worry, there are not many of them, and they're very clear in terms of their English language. For example, the word repetition. He takes the motto, remember the opening, ba-da-dum-bum-ba. He takes it, he puts it in different key, and then repeats it. Repeat, repeat. But he doesn't just repeat it, does he? He moves it up a step. Up, up. And when a composer does that, it is called a sequence, because it's just a sequence of repeated ideas. We could even say in this case, it is a sequence of repeated mottos up by a step. So from the beginning, all the way, and I just did a total of 6 measures, we're going to put them together for you, that motto has been omnipresent so far. Now, I'm going to go now 12 bars, a little bit more slowly, and narrate what's happening. So here's the beginning. This is the fugue subject, and then the counter subject comes in, but that subject is still there in the higher part. Now here's that episode. Up sequence, up sequence. Now a little surprise, we'll talk about this in a second. And then in the left hand, the subject. Hear that just like the beginning? Then we have more episode. Do you hear that motto? And then we have, as I told you before, the subject, but it is in a major key. And it does sound quite transformed when it's in the major key. And if it wasn't for that insistent ostinato rhythm, ba-da-dum-bum-ba, it's quite easy to miss. Now I want to take a second and flip it and now talk about the counter subject, because what he does is so brilliant. And yet when you hear it just as a listener, it doesn't sound like it's a trick or a compositional device. It just sounds like music. Remember, there are 2 elements to the counter subject. One is a scale down. And then 8th notes, almost like a walking bass. Scale, 8th notes. So remember, we talk about episode is not subject or counter subject, but it can be based on them. In that first episode, as I showed you, in the upper part, it is a sequence based on the opening motto. But I'm going to play it up the octave, so it's further away, and so you can really concentrate on the lower part. So what is that lower part? A scale. So here's the interesting thing. I love this about Bach. The counter subject had begun with the scale going down, but this scale goes up. And then it repeats higher, which is a sequence. beep ba 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 bum, beep ba 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 bum, beep bum bum bum. There's a word for this. When you take a pattern, if it had been going down and is now going up, that is called an inversion. It inverts it. So from the beginning, all the way through that entire section that I played for you, all of the material is generated either from that opening motto or from the counter subject. Now I'm going to skip ahead and show you that next episode. If you're looking at the score, we're talking about bars 9 and 10. The top part of it, I think you'll know immediately what this is. Derived exactly from that motto, and you probably heard that that is also a repetition and a sequence, but lower this time, goes down. Now, there are actually 3 voices. We call them in fugues voices, whether it's singing or playing. There are 3 voices to this fugue. You might remember it that in the last episode there were 5 voices to sicut locutus est. It can be much harder on a keyboard instrument to hear the different voices because once they're played together, you are more apt to hear them as a little bit like a chord. But in fact, there is a beautiful duet that happens here. Let me play the duet and then pick it apart for you. So I played the higher part first, the higher voice. Let me play that again. And then the lower voice against that does this. Isn't that wonderful? So together they sound like this. You can very clearly hear that it's the same material, but in different parts of the scale. We call this canonic imitation. We talked about that word canon, C-A-N-O-N, which is the precursor to the fugue. It's just like row, row, row your boat. And it creates that polyphonic texture that we talked about, that one voice answers another, but it's the exact same material. And that material is the motto from the beginning. Now, let me play with the left hand. There are 3 parts in this case, and very often 2 parts are in the right hand, 1 part in the left hand, but not always. So listen to all of that together. So do you hear those running 16ths? You might hear that that is actually also a sequence, which is not surprising because if there's a sequence in one hand, there's probably going to be a sequence everywhere because the tonal areas are moving around. Dee ba be ba be ba 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 ba. Do you know where that material comes from? Remember we talked about the counter subject, beginning with a scale. That's where it comes from. So the upper 2 voices are derived from that opening motto in the subject, and the left hand is derived from the counter subject. We have now gone 10 measures and not introduced any other kind of material. And this happens to be in bar 11, where the major key appearance of the fugue subject comes in. And that'll take us to bar 12. So from the beginning through 12 bars, we have had the subject present in one way or another all the way through. I'm going to play from the beginning and see if you can follow that. Da-da-dum-bum-pa. Just listen for that motto all the way through. sequence. Then fugue subject in the left hand, episode. Now major key, the subject. And then something slightly different happens. I think you probably followed that all the way through. There is one other little surprise that I absolutely love. And this happens often in fugues, that there is something called a false entry, which makes your ear think that the subject is going to be completed in one part of the register, but then it goes somewhere else. Can I show you what I mean? It's after that first sequence, the episode that goes like this. Here it is. Ba-da-dum. And it sounds like ba-da-dum, be-dum, ba-da-dum, beep-bum, that it's going to keep going, but then straight away, the left hand pushes in. And it's wonderful. I talked a little bit in the first episode about the way that the composer creates this sense of expectation in the listener as they set up the next appearance of the subject. The false entry is wonderful because it surprises and tricks the listener. Let me play that at tempo and really listen for that. It's just brief, but then it goes on. So this is the episode with the sequence. It's wonderful, and in context of a fugue, those false entries can be really, really terrific. Now, you may remember that I said that there were only 3 measures without that motto ostinato, ba-da-dum, bum-bum. Following the major key iteration of the fugue subject that you just heard, we get 2 of those measures. So listen to what Bach does in here. Now you probably already hear that that is also a sequence. It then goes up, and then a higher key. Now we talked about the use of scales, that in that counter subject, it started with the scale down, and here we've got scales going up, so that is an inversion of the counter subject. So it's not like these 2 measures are unrelated to the opening. It just doesn't have that really insistent motto that we have otherwise through this piece. The other thing that we have here in the left hand, we actually have this in the counter subject, that you had that scale going down. Then remember I said that it was 8th notes? Dee-da-dee-dum, be-da-dee-dum, ba-dee-da-dum. So it is that material. So for these 2 bars, it's not that they are not related, it's just that they are derived from the counter subject rather than the subject. And as I've said already, taking any amount of the subject out prepares the ear for the expectation of having the subject return. And that's what happens here. I'm going to go back and play just a couple bars earlier from that major key subject and then go on and glue this in. Subject at the top in the highest voice, and then that bit that does not have the ostinato but prepares us for this. I just want to say something very quickly about this. I'm going to say in a moment a couple things about why fugues are difficult to play on keyboard. And this is one of those examples. There are 3 voices we've talked about. It is hardest to bring the subject out when it is in the middle voice, when it's not at the top and not at the bottom as it is here. It requires great independence of fingers, and I have to admit, I am not the pianist that you will be hearing through the complete Bach in Worcester. People like Jeremy Dank and Simona Dinnerstein who have extraordinary technical control. So that takes us up to another episode. And I would like to play for you the top and bottom of this, the top voice and the bottom voice, and leave out the middle voice for a second. So it's pretty clear that you get this ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum that we have in the beginning. The left hand finishes the motto idea. Be-da-dee-da-dum, be-da-dee-da-dum, be-da-da-da-da. And as you can no doubt hear, this is also a sequence. It is rising. I'm going to keep going, but I'm going to play it not as Bach wrote. You'll see in a second. So leaving out the middle voice for a moment. The voice is swapped, so I had to change something. In fact, because the range of the harpsichord is smaller, and also maybe he just didn't want to go up, instead of continuing up that scale, otherwise it is all the way up, returning us to C minor. But in fact, Bach jumps down an octave here, ba-ba-ba, and returns us, probably so that when the subject comes in here, it's not too high. It might sound a little bit too odd on the harpsichord. So I showed you the outer two voices. What does the middle voice do? We're used to this now, aren't we? We've had this before. Very early on, the first episode. So this is just like that first episode, but now has three voices. It has that bass voice in there as well. And that material is the inversion of the descending scale from the counter subject. Now I'm just going to pause for a second and say that I know that these observations are now coming fast and furious. Don't worry if some of this is starting to feel like it's washing over you a little bit. The point that I'm trying to make with this Fugue in C minor from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1, is that Bach is extremely economical in his compositional technique. That he takes a very small idea and spins out an entire movement from that. So don't worry about the particulars. I'm just wanting to make the point over and over again that he is able to generate a whole movement from one idea. Let me put now this section, this episode together. As you can hear, it sequences, it's going up a scale, and he's putting three voices together now. Setting up the expectation for this. The fugue subject at the top. So we're about 2/3 of the way through. 31 bars and we're at bar 22. We have had a number of episodes that use that ostinato moving up. We had that episode that did not use the subject, but used instead the material from the counter subject. I want to show you one final extended episode that I refer to as the lyrical episode. Bach does often use the episode to create more beautiful, more cantabile, more singing music, particularly if the fugue subject itself is either rhythmic or a little bit dour, a little bit sober, as this one is. This is what I like to call lyrical episode in this fugue. It goes a little bit towards the major key, and it's just a more singing style. And again, this canonic imitation between those two voices. In the right hand, be ba ba da dum, be ba. In the middle, bum bum ba da dum, bum ba. Then it's slightly more melodic even. Ba da dee da dee da ba. That would be more apparent if you had a soprano and an alto, for example, singing and they had text. In the keyboard, you have to make those sound a little bit more separate from one another so you hear that counterpoint. And the left hand is just doing these scales up and down. As a sequence, remembering, of course, that any scale in this piece is derived from the counter subject. And as I keep saying, we are setting up an expectation that the fugue subject is going to come back. In this case, it comes back in the bass voice, which, if it was the organ, would be played on pedal and would be a little bit larger. And I did say this in the previous episode, that often near the end of a fugue, it will come back in the bass voice, whether it's singing or the bass pedals in an organ or here on the harpsichord, because there is something a little bit stronger about putting it in that voice. I'm going to go back now and play from the fugue subject, heading into what I call that lyrical sequence episode, and then you will get to hear the fugue subject in the bass, and I'm going to finish it. There is one last iteration of the fugue subject without a counter subject, more or less unadorned at the end, as if Bach wants it to have one final airing. So let's go from the fugue subject first into the lyrical section. Sequence, setting up the expectation for the left hand. And here it is, in the right hand one last time. And there is no counter subject there at the very end. But otherwise, you have had this motto almost omnipresent through this entire movement. We'll play the whole thing again in a second, and you can listen for that, and you can follow those different ideas. The sections that we call exposition, where the fugue subject is present, and the sections that we call episode, where it is not present. So let's finish the first half of this podcast episode by listening, as we did at the beginning, to the entire Fugue in C minor from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. Yes, follow the subject as you did before, but this time also be cognizant of how it goes in and out of those expositions where the fugue subject and counter subject are present, or those longer episodes which are usually sequences where there is no subject. And then when we come back, we will talk about an organ fugue. We have spent the bulk of this episode talking about that fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier, but it would be unthinkable to have an episode about fugues and not talk about Bach's music for the organ. Now, there are not the same named collections like the Art of the Fugue or the Well-Tempered Clavier for the organ as there are for the harpsichord, but there are countless preludes and fugues, fantasias and fugues, toccatas and fugues for the organ, and these works are some of the most important works in the entire organ repertoire. So I just wanted to touch on one, and I also wanted to quite literally flip the script because we have spent so much time talking about the subject and the counter subject, and in this episode talking about how the episode is directly derived from the subject or the counter subject. But for this next fugue, what I really want to do is only look at the episode material, which is not even all that directly derived from the subject or the counter subject. In this sense, I want to make the point that Bach drew on so many different influences. This fugue, which you are going to hear played by Wesley Hall, as I mentioned, a great organist in the Worcester area at the First Baptist Church and a member of the Worcester Bach Collective. He's going to share with you this recording of what is known as the Little Fugue in G minor, and you may have heard this before. It's very famous. That is the fugue subject, and you'll hear all of that in a minute. I wanted to deconstruct these episodes for you first and then play the recording that he made on the organ and little clips from it. Sometimes it's a little easier to hear things on the piano because we're a little bit more used to that. So I just want to show you a few things that are really important in Baroque composition in a larger sense. As I say, not because they're derived from the subject or the counter subject, but in this case because this is the Baroque language. And one of the most important things is a chord progression that is referred to as falling fifths. I'll talk about that in 1 second. This is one of the ways that Bach and other Baroque composers explore sequences. We looked so far at sequences that move up or down in scales, but you can move further afield by doing the same thing but moving around what is known as the circle of fifths. Now let me show you quickly what that means. You just take a first note, in this case we'll use a C, and you go up a fifth, which is a G, and then up a fifth, D, and we keep going up a fifth, A, E, B, F, and then it goes back to C, so that you have moved around a circle. But that doesn't sound particularly interesting, does it? But if you do it in the other direction, going down fifths, C, F, B, E, A, D, G, and back to C, then you can make chords out of those. So C, F, B, E, A, D, G, C. And that might actually sound more familiar when I played in that order. Very, very common Baroque chord progression. And you can do that in any key, major or minor. In this composition, the Little Fugue in G minor, Bach uses falling fifth progressions throughout the episode. This sort of chord progression, by the way, is really closely associated with the Italian composers, particularly people like Vivaldi. And so you don't really get a melody necessarily. It is a repeated pattern going from key to key. Let me show you what I mean. And I'm only going to play the right hand and the left hand for the first of these. This happens to start in D minor. This is what I mean. I don't know if that sounded like it was moving around in fifths, but it did. D, G, C, F, and so on and so forth. But it is slightly masked because it's also a duet, isn't it? And because he's Bach and he's very clever and he adds other things, he has this left-hand pattern. In a lesser composer, he might have just played the chords in the left hand. But because he's Bach and is very inventive, he does this. And it changes at the end. And then he comes back to that fugue subject. But like I say, we're flipping the order of this around and we're really talking about episode. And you could find a pattern like that in any Bach piece. As I say, it's not directly based on the subject or the counter subject, but it is what might be called a Baroque musical trope, for example, that we find these often. Let me show you another example. Keep in mind that a fugue is just full of alternating exposition sections, which have the fugue subject, and episode sections, which do not. Here is another falling fifth pattern. Let me show it to you. I'll take more out of it. This time he adds the pedal into it. So I'm leaving out the very top part. And then the fugue subject. Because in those alternating exposition and episodes, it will always come back. So you may have heard, it's very much like that first section. The first section was, and then this next section, it is a major key. Because as I said, these falling fifth progressions work equally well in major or minor key. So he added in a pedal, you'll hear that in a minute, but do you remember that left-hand pattern that was all scales? This time, he redistributes. This is one of the ways in which you create contrast in composition. You can take the same material and redistribute it. So it sounds quite different, but compositionally, you're actually using the same material. So let me show you that. He puts it at the top this time. But it's essentially the same material that had been in the left hand. So let me put that all together. Let's take a second and let me let you hear both of those sections played on the organ by Wesley, these two clips. So in the first one, this is a good way to orient yourself. It is in minor key, and the moving part, the 16th notes are in the left hand. The second part is in a major key, and the moving part is in the right hand. So here's the first episode example. And now let's listen to the second episode example. There is one more episode example that is based on the falling fifth idea. So let me deconstruct this for you. I'm going to leave out the right hand for a second. This begins in a minor key as well. So this is what it sounds like. They're just chord outlines. But it's that still down a fifth, down a fifth. And by the way, I should make the point, in case you're thinking, but sometimes it sounds like you're going up and not down. If you were only ever going down, you would have to start really high on the keyboard and go really low. And so that's not really practical. So what happens, and don't worry if this doesn't make sense to you, but I will throw in a little music theory here, that if you turn a fifth upside down and go up instead, so C down a fifth goes to F, well, you could get to that F by going up a fourth, 1, 2, 3, 4, to that F, and that's what happens. It goes down, then up, then down, then up, then down, then up, then down. And that allows the music to stay within one range. As I say, don't worry if that doesn't make sense to you. But for those of you who have done some music theory, I should be clear about that. Let me just play that chord progression one more time. And you can hear there are two voices even in there. And that imitative counterpoint, it's very simple counterpoint. It's just the outline of a chord, then the outline of a chord. What does he do this time? This is what the right hand does. You remember before that was a bunch of scales. This time he uses this arpeggio idea, which, by the way, sounds particularly good on the organ. This, again, is a Baroque trope. All that is going on in this section, let me play it for you. There's no melody to hold on to. It's just a series of thirds. And then something a little bit different here. This music is so typical of the Baroque era, and like I said, you'll hear it a lot in Vivaldi, and then Bach, who is influenced by the Italians, takes it on. You could be forgiven on some level for thinking of it slightly as musical filler. Because it doesn't further the subject or the counter subject. But isn't filler needed in architecture of any kind? Not everything is going to be fundamental material. Sometimes you need a little bit of filigree, some gilt edging here. And again, as I keep saying, this is also a way to prepare the listener's ears for the return of the subject, which is very important. At the end of this section, let me show you what he does in the left hand. And I'm sure you can hear that as a sequence now. And he mixes it up a little bit, some scales and some jumps. So a sequence in that sense, but listen to what the left hand does. He's moving at the end up by half steps, and that's really a way to create some excitement. And as you might imagine, we are headed towards the fugue subject, and in a moment I'm going to play this section for you. The fugue subject comes in at the end in the pedal, and as I said before, that is very common in an organ fugue, that the last statement of the fugue subject will be really powerful in that low bass. So let me put that together with the scale going up and the sequence. Again, no melody, but it builds excitement, and then we have this. fugue subject comes in. One last thing about this section to show you. What we have here is a series of what are known as suspensions. This is not the perfect example of suspensions. I'll do one of those in a second. The two different voices are a fifth apart, or 5 notes apart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they're moving down by steps in a sequence. What makes a suspension is this. It begins with what is known as a consonant interval, which means an interval that is not dissonant. And then introduces a dissonance, which then resolves, and that just keeps going down like that in these suspensions. The more classic suspension, the notes are closer together like this. So you get that clash that then resolves, clash that then resolves. And it's just another one of these Baroque tropes. And it's a way to continue that circle around the scale, around this circle of fifths. And as always, prepares the ear. The longer a suspension goes on, or the longer a sequence goes on, the more the ear is expecting something exciting to come. Let me just have Wesley play for you that whole sequence from the arpeggios, and then it went to these scales, including the half steps in the left hand, finishing with the sequence. And then the fugue subject in the organ pedals. So listen to that whole section. As you'll hear, it goes to the end of the piece. This is the final section. And then there's one more thing I want to show you about in these episodes in the little fugue in G minor to show you one more of these Baroque tropes. But let's listen to this final section on organ first. Now, to finish this episode, one more of these compositional devices. And this one I really love because it returns us to what we've been saying so much about Bach, is how economical he is. That all you have to do is have an idea, and then you can put it through the computer of the compositional brain to say, well, I could do this with it, or I could do that with it. In this little episode section that's still part of this fugue, one voice does this. So those eighth notes with a little rest, beat-um, bum, beat-um, bum, beat-um. And you probably heard that that's also a sequence descending. The right hand at the same time does this. And you clearly hear that that's just going around in a little circle, descending. And even that, by the way, this pattern is very, very Baroque. They even had a Latin name for it. They loved to name all of these devices. And in Latin, this was called circulatio, going around in a circle. And as I've been saying about these Baroque idioms, it's not nice to think of it as filler music, but it is in a sense. It's getting you from one point to another. And these circulatio in combination with a sequence move you along. Let me play those two parts together. Now what I love about what he does next, and this is classic Bach, classic Baroque, is he's written a bar and a half, and then all that he does is flip them. So it's the same material. So it's very, very efficient. But here's the interesting thing. Although all he did was to take a pattern and then swap them, they sound really very different because of the way they interact. Let me play them together, and then I'll go back and deconstruct it one more time. And then the fugue subject comes in, happens to be major key this time. So I think that it's because of the ear's great propensity to orient itself towards the upper part. What you really process is this. So when you have this pattern the first time lower, you don't really bring that to the fore in your ear. So what happens is it sounds fresh. When it goes higher here, here. So on the one hand, you could say, well, but Bach is just using the same material twice in a row, and he is. He's just flipping it around. But the way that the ear experiences that does not feel trite in any sense. We talked about the word inversion earlier in this episode, and in that context, it had to do with the countersubject going up a scale, so that when Bach would use material with the scale going down, that was an inversion of the countersubject. This, when you take a pattern, two voices, for example, and then you swap them around, that is a kind of inversion. It is called invertible counterpoint. Invertible counterpoint. Counterpoint just meaning that you have these two lines against each other, contra, against one another, and you flip them, you invert them. It is invertible counterpoint. It is two lines that will work equally well when they get flipped over. And I love it as a technique, and particularly in Bach's vocal duets. The first section, the soprano will sing line A, the alto will sing line B, and then Bach will just reverse them and have the soprano singing line B and the alto singing line A. But like I say, because the ear orients to the high part, we hear it really differently. So let's do this. Let's listen to Wesley play on the organ, because it'll sound different, that timbre, that color. Just this little bit of invertible counterpoint, and then let's listen to the entire little fugue in G minor. First, this section of invertible counterpoint, an example of episode. Okay, let's listen to the whole fugue. And the great thing is you know how to listen to fugues now. Your ear will always find that subject. In this case, and your ear can find the countersubject. Let's not worry about the countersubject for this fugue, because what we're really listening to is those examples of episode, which in this case are so often falling fifth. And then that one with the arpeggios. and then that one little bit of invertible counterpoint. And I should tell you that that is right about in the middle. So let's listen now to Wesley Hall playing the Little Fugue in G minor, BWV 578, on the organ at the First Baptist Church in Worcester, Massachusetts. So there we are. Believe it or not, we have come to the end of 2 episodes about the fugue. And as I have said, we could do 100 episodes about Bach's fugues. So prominent are they in his repertoire, and so unsurpassed a master of the form Bach was. So join me for the next episode in Bach 101, and we will continue our foray through the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. I will see you then.